So this webinar series has really evolved out of the MBC Grieving Together group that Allison Tischler and I started, because we all need to be having these conversations, and particularly in the metastatic breast cancer community, we're facing these things sooner rather than later. But there is such a taboo. There is such a hesitation, I think, for people to really talk and prepare for what your end of life looks like. I think back on how much time and effort and focus I put into birthing plans to bring my kids into the world. And this is just, I think, kind of flows from that concept that if we're going to plan for the beginning of life, we should plan and think about what we want at the end of life as well. So that's the basis, I think, of having some of these conversations. And I'm so excited that so many people have said yes when I said, hey, I want you to do this podcast thing and talk about this really hard subject. But we have two people today who have, whether in their professional or their personal lives or both, have made having these conversations at the end of life their specialty. And so Jennifer O'Brien has been with us previously. She's the author of the book, The Hospice Doctor's Widow, which basically is her journal that she published. And she was just telling us before we started that she has 77 reviews, and she wants to get to 100 reviews before the end of the year. So all of you who are listening, buy the book, write a nice review, only good reviews, of course, so that she gets up to 100 reviews. But you know, the opening yourself up and being vulnerable the way that you have, Jennifer, is just such a gift to so many people, and really brings a really difficult subject into the realm of something that's manageable. So I think that that's really amazing. And we also have Valerie Armand, who I met, I think, through Jennifer, actually. And she is a LPN and a certified end-of-life doula. She has over 20 years of experience doing this extraordinary process transition with people. And she has founded a LLC called Exiting Gracefully. And she's also a consultant with Dying Your Way. And her passion is exactly what we're talking about, removing the stigma that society has placed on facing our mortality. She literally does this for a living. So thank you, Valerie, for being here today. And I have to mention, she has a radio show as well, which is called Mortal Musings. And I got to be a guest on her show, and it was super fun to be talking about those musings about our mortality. So anyway, thank you, Valerie, for being here today.
Thank you.
So I just want to start with some basic information about both of you. So Jennifer, would you introduce yourself to our audience and maybe share a little bit about why you decided to publish your wonderful journal?
Sure, absolutely. Thanks for having me. So I have been in healthcare for 33 years, teaching physicians how to run their practices more effectively from a business and leadership standpoint. And not too long before that career started, I lost my only sibling. He was in an accident. And I lost my mother some years later. And so when in 2010, I was down here in Little Rock, Arkansas, and met a guy called Bob Lemberg, who had been a plastic and reconstructive surgeon for a long time, but had had a neck injury and so had to retrain. And he chose to retrain in hospice and palliative care. So after 30 plus years as a plastic and reconstructive surgeon, he chose palliative care and hospice. And, you know, having lost several people in my family, I knew how important this work was. And besides, he was really cute and fun and smart and all that good stuff. And so we fell in love and we got married. And then in 2015, 15, he found a couple of lumps in his neck and was diagnosed with a metastatic stage 4 cancer. And so all of that stuff that he'd been through as a physician, helping patients understand living with serious illness and dying of serious illness and their families and so forth, and all of the stuff that I knew from a personal standpoint, of course, now that turned on us. We had to turn that on ourselves, and we did. And he lived for 22 months, and I kept an art journal as a form of self-care, and I continued to keep it a little bit after he died. And then it turned out that this art journal that I was keeping helped a couple of other people who had been diagnosed with life-limiting illness, and so I was encouraged to publish it, and I found a publisher, and it was released about 3 weeks before the pandemic started. So that's where I am.
Valerie, would you like to introduce yourself and talk about how your career has come to focus on people at the end of their lives?
Sure, you gave me such a great introduction. I appreciate that. And I just want to say how blessed I am to have made a connection with both you and Jennifer. I'll put in the chat the link to the radio show so they can listen to your interviews.
Thank you.
Jen is a repeat offender. She came in clutch for me last week. So really appreciate both of you being part of my vision and mission. Again, like you had said, I'm a nurse by trade. Working in end of life for the past, hospice specifically 17 years, but prior to that in geriatrics over 20 years total. And really just got drawn into the end of life realm to where I felt as if I had outgrown traditional hospice itself and found myself more and more drawn to advocating outside of the confines of the hospice model and reaching out to folks maybe a little more upstream that aren't exactly at that very end stage of life, and stressing the importance of having these discussions when we're not in a crisis. The saying is, it always seems too early until it's too late. And all too often that's unfortunately the case, where people are making very, very important decisions where we don't get a do-over. Again, under pressure, under-educated, under-empowered, and, not always the most optimal outcomes. We talk about destigmatizing death, and I also use the term desensitizing ourselves to the topics around death and dying, end of life. Somewhere along the way, we fell into the delusion that we're immortal, and or the superstition of speaking about death is going to make it happen sooner. And that's, again, very unfortunate. And it's easy for me in my day-to-day operations to speak so freely about it. I have experienced death, not just professionally, but personally within my own family. But it's really been very life-changing for me to have met you, Abigail, and your world, because conversation is one thing, but it's really your reality in a lot of ways, a little more pressing, I suppose, than the fact that we all are going to die. We just don't know when. But you, in your, the depths of your day-to-day operations and things that you all are dealing with, your current realities, and still having the courage and the spirit and the wherewithal to be reaching out and supporting others, I think is just so beautiful. So I'm really humbled to be a part of your world, and I'd just like to be able to help in any way that I can, and whether it's guidance, mentoring, just general information. So I'm really glad to be here.
Thank you, Valerie. And it is quite, I think, perfect that a guest has said in the last 4, at least, webinars about this, talking about things, making decisions, and making preparations before there's a crisis, before there is, you must go to hospice now because we have nothing else for you. Having thought through and researched what you want and what's available to you, before that crisis is so important. We heard that in the legal context. We heard that in kind of this medical context, whether it's palliative care or hospice care. We just keep hearing that concept over and over, that thinking ahead and preparing is so important. And so with that, I want to come back to you, Jen. When did you and Bob start talking about the things that he wanted at the end of his life, and how did that come up?
Oh, we talked about it very freely from the start, from very early in our relationship. And because of his work and because of my personal experience. You know, my brother was in this accident and he was in a coma for 3 weeks, and then there was not sufficient brain activity. He had a case of meningitis that sort of attacked the remaining portion of his brain that was active. And so my parents had to decide to extubate him. And that was when I was 18 years old. And so, you know, and then with what Bob dealt with pretty much every day at work, yes, we spoke about it very freely from early on in our relationship.
And there are some things in your book that help people think through. I think one of the things that I loved the most was the checklist that he had on how to evaluate whether to do another chemo. Can you talk about that a little bit?
So I wouldn't know the first thing about evaluating a chemo. And so I observed Bob do it repeatedly. Because I think by the time he died, I think he had basically chosen, without really openly choosing, not to take the 5th one. We had it in our possession. It was an oral, and he just never took it, and probably died about 3 or 4 months later. So there were several that kind of, you know, gave us wonderful time together. But he would, I basically would watch his process and took it and translated it in, you know, into language that you and I understand, about, like, first understanding what is the purpose of this treatment? Is it curative? Is it palliative? Is it life extending? You know, that's really important from the start. And I think a lot of folks that don't have a medical connection don't always understand that. I think there can be some real ambiguity with, okay, so what is this going to accomplish? If it's going, you know, if it does its job, are we looking at me feeling, you know, me having less pain? Or are we looking at, you know, me getting cured? Or are we looking at me possibly getting some more time? And then the other thing he always took into account, and this one honestly was probably more when he would work through this, help patients understand this process. And that was there a big event coming up, the birth of a grandbaby or a wedding or something, that the person really wanted to risk some rough side effects to try to be present for, if that was the case. And then just what are those side effects, and how do they, with you know, just evaluating those, and then finally, I think I have on there disease fatigue, and I think that's really where Bob got by the end, is that, you know, there had been just a lot of complications and side effects that had offered, you know, a really rough time, and you know, it was time, and there wasn't there was, in the sense that he did stay alive. I'm coming up on the 4th anniversary of his death in January, and I remember very distinctly at this time of year that year thinking, oh my gosh, he's going to die on Christmas. He's going to ruin Christmas for me. And I probably felt that way for a couple of days, and then I realized, oh no, he's not. He's not going to do that to me, and he didn't. And I said, you know, we're gonna get to mid-January, chemotherapy. And sure enough, we did. So anyway, that's not what you asked about. But yes, that notion of it is your decision. You know, you don't just have to take the next chemotherapy. It is very much your decision. I think that Bob probably tried more chemotherapies than I think I would have tried. But it wasn't my illness and it wasn't my death. So every time he faced this decision, I would simply say, I support you in whatever decision you make. You know, I support you. That's all I knew to do, because those are hard decisions. But I think they, in our case, I felt, you know, and I think he felt too, he wanted to make those himself.
And I'm reminded of the discussions that we were having with Dr. Medina, the palliative physician that was on with us the last time we were with you, Jen, and her just really talking about how doctors who prescribe curative treatments are not always comfortable with this idea that maybe it's time to stop.
Yeah.
And having those conversations with your doctors, but also knowing within yourself, this is my line. Again, figuring out that line ahead of time, figuring out, you know, when is it going to be time to stop, is so important. And so Valerie, I want to turn to you. When people come to you and they're within this, you know, should I take this next chemo? Should I stop? Is it time for me to stop? How do you help facilitate that decision, or what do you help people think about in order to make that decision?
You know, interestingly, a lot of the times they already know what it is they do or don't want to do or pursue. And so it's almost more of giving them permission that it's, you know, what are their reasons why, you know, like you had mentioned earlier, there's a holiday or an event that they're trying to, you know, be there for, or not wanting to die on a holiday or in the holiday season and hanging on. And I would say the vast majority of the time, anybody who is, you know, struggling with those decisions, again, it's already made, but it's verbalizing that decision. And again, majority of the time it's for someone else, not for themselves. And it's getting the family also to understand, you know, to take themselves out of the equation, you know, for your loved one. And again, true love, you know, are you wanting them to fight for you or for them? And, you know, you're not the person on the outside that's going through the treatments and the side effects. And Abigail, you had shared with me in the past, you know, that just the simple terminology that we use around cancer situations and any disease for that matter, you know, giving up or losing a fight, or, you know, succumbing to the battle and the cancer's winning. And just to hear your perspective on that, you know, it's really not very sensitive, you know, not sensitive terminology. You even, I think, went so far as to say the cancer murdered someone, which is probably a much more accurate statement if we're being real. You know, that's not because they're giving up, it's because, you know, the cancer is doing what it's going to do. And what do we want that path to look like? How do we, you know, giving the choice and giving the ability to make the choice, you know, what do you want? What is your goal? That's usually a very big question. You know, is it quality of life? Is it quantity of life? Is it, you know, you may have extended time, but again, what is that going to look like realistically? And, you know, I often have to be very brave and courageous and also very sensitive to where people are at. There are people that don't want reality. And then there's people that look you in the eye and say, just be honest with me. You know, what do you see? And, so yeah, it's very, like I said earlier, humbling to be in a position to help someone make their life or death choices. And a lot of times it's just listening and them being able to say their own words out loud, or an opportunity for them to express themselves freely in front of their family members. in a safe way, and letting that land where it lands and let the dust settle a little bit, and for them to, you know, kind of put their brains around what the patient themselves really, really wants. As hard as that may be, you know, harder, you know, I often say it, you know, in the very end stages, it's harder, you know, as the care becomes less because the person is maybe less responsive, less active, and it's almost harder for the family to not have anything to do per se. You know, so it's easier to be doing something, you know, and it's our nature to nurture and to, you know, you've got to eat, you've got to drink, you've got to get up, you've got to move, and there are no rules. So.
Could you give us an example of what it looks like to really empower somebody to say what it is that they already know? Like you were talking about, what does that look like when you're empowering somebody that you're working with?
You know, one-on-one is a lot easier. They'll tend to be more open and more honest and just flat out say, you know, I'm tired. I don't want to do this again. They're offering me another treatment, but I know it's not, you know, going to make any difference. You know, may make a little difference, but it's not worth it to me, you know, but it's so much more powerful for them to be able to do that in front of their family. And it can be uncomfortable and awkward, but it's just, again, really, again, goes back to making your wishes known ahead of time and how you want things to go, and that you know, for them to say they're okay with whatever that looks like. And then usually there may be conversations on the side with the family, you know, it's kind of different levels and directions, and it's not a one and done conversation usually, you know, but it's a great launching point. And then, you know, again, with what I get to do on a daily basis, it's really, again, just amazing to be part of that journey. And yeah, it's a little overwhelming at times, but the reward, knowing that if we didn't have those conversations, how things may have looked a lot differently, and not necessarily in a positive way.
Now, Jen, in one of our previous podcasts, you talked about going through the dying process with Bob was one of the most intimate times that you all had together. And it sounds like Valerie is talking about this powerfulness of being able to talk about your wishes with your family and then really understand that. And it sounds to me like you and Bob had that. Would you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. The entire thing was pretty intimate, from, you know, from knowing the details of what he wanted, you know, being the one who knows, that I knew that he wanted to die in inpatient hospice, not at home. I knew that he wanted a mild palliative sedation. I knew that he didn't want any visitors at the very end. We went through all of our things, and we sold our house and moved to a much smaller a condominium so that I would be comfortable after his death living here alone. And as we went through things, you know, art, he was a big art collector, and other things, he would tell me and ask, you know, are you okay if I give this to my niece? Absolutely. Or I would like you to give this to so-and-so after I die. He wrote a number of letters, and at times asked, you know, to people who were very meaningful to him, and most of the time asked me to sort of read them, you know, proofread them, whatever kind of thing, and then mail them. And so all of that, yeah, was super, super intimate. And you know, I wouldn't trade that for anything. I mean, it was a level of intimacy that, you know, I had not, you know, I had a closeness with my mother as she was dying, but it was nothing like, you know, how Bob and I came close together.
And you talked about a hospice facility, and that's where he wanted to die. Well, and obviously because he was a hospice doctor, he would have known which facilities had a place or which would do a better job supporting you guys at home. But was that part of his the process of selecting a hospice company?
No. Bob never. Bob was so Bob died when he was 69, and he had started working in a hospital as what was then called an orderly, which was sort of a nurse's assistant kind of person, and when he was 18 years old. And
Wow.
at 18, his father, who had been a physician, also said, you have to go work in the county hospital as an orderly to see what this thing's all about. And he did. And an orderly, this was not only was it like more of a nursing assistant, but it was also like what we now call environmental services. So cleaned up after people. The orderly did it all. This was just an old position that just doesn't exist anymore. And he loved it. From the moment he started taking care of patients as an orderly at age 18, he absolutely loved it. And so by the time he died, he had spent over 50 years in a hospital, the bulk of his life. He was a very, very shy person. So it was through work that he was able to kind of really relate to people. And we didn't have kids. He didn't have kids, so he frequently volunteered to be on call on holidays so that his partners, could be with their families for the holidays. And so, he was more at home in a hospital than sometimes he really felt at home. So he knew he wanted to die inpatient status. I think for us, the hardest thing, and I've kind of reworked this in my head, but I think he didn't realize how well I knew that, and how important, that I knew that was really important to him. But you have to be fairly, sick to be admitted to an inpatient status. And so he didn't end up inpatient until about 4 days. He was outpatient. He was at home hospice for probably close to a week, and then inpatient for like the last 4 days. But yeah, so he just had this idea. A lot of people have the idea that they want to die at home. And sadly, actually, something like 75% of us think we want to die at home, and only 25% of us are actually able to do that. And part of it is because we don't talk about what we're talking about right now, because when certain things happen, when kidneys fail, when certain things happen, people can't be in their homes, right? If they go to the hospital and their kidneys fail and they have dialysis, and again, I'm not a clinician, so I don't know, but there gets to be a point, right, where someone has so much support in an inpatient setting and they're going to die, but they can't go home, knowing that at the end of life comes death, that's how it ends. I mean, there's no alternative. There's no different outcome for anybody. And for someone who has a diagnosis like metastatic cancer, it's gonna happen probably that much sooner. So trying to gauge, if that's your goal, then trying to gauge, as you say, yes or no to these additional treatment options, how's that going to impact that ultimate goal?
Such a great reminder to begin with the end in mind, right? I think that applies to so many different things. But Valerie, I wanted to go back to you. How do you have those conversations with people about where it is they want to die, and how do you just ask it like that? Like, where do you want to be when you die? Or do you back into it in a more politically correct way?
It's every situation is entirely different. Usually it's an organic conversation, kind of have a way of getting to all the kind of topics we need to touch on. I wish there was a textbook way to describe it. It's almost like, I want to say there's an art to it. Just being able to meet people where they're at is so important. Just coming in with acceptance, no matter what their answers are going to be, whether I agree with their answers or not. And it's almost kind of like, I want to say a CSI, kind of just feeling out the situation, the dynamics of the group, whoever it is that you're with, whether it's, adult children, or sometimes it's siblings, and sometimes it's their parents. And people can be on all different levels. There's usually that one person that's, right spot on, knows, what the patient wants. And then there's usually one of those rogue outliers that are just, well, we're not just going to let her die here. What do you mean she's just going to starve to death and we're going to sit and watch her starve to death? And everybody's looking at them like, no, that's not what we're going to do. So it's very interesting. I usually just say a really big prayer, and I don't know sometimes how the words come, but I just feel like it's definitely a gift. Because again, it's just like door number 1, door number 2, door number 3, and you don't know what door you're walking through and who you're going to meet, because I get a lot of cold referrals that, I may have paperwork with clinicals and, all the hospital jargon and all, and sometimes they look way worse than you're anticipating. They're very, very much more sick and frail than they looked on paper. And sometimes it's completely the opposite, I'm not to be flip about it, but I mean, a train wreck literally on paper, and then you meet them and it's like, who's the patient, So it's always very interesting and very dynamic, and you just got to be quick on your feet. And sometimes you'll have an entire conversation and everything sounds one way, and then a few days go by and you revisit, and it's like, did we even have a conversation? So sometimes like I say, it's a journey, and the earlier we begin that journey, the more time people have to process in a healthier way, and at their own pace, rather than a rushed, we're being discharged from the hospital and you have to go home on hospice and this is just how it is. It's a little late then to decide if you want to die at home, or if you want to die, in a facility, or if you have to put, there's sometimes people are just not capable physically to provide 24-hour care in the home for maybe an elderly loved one. We're living longer, we're working longer. People are still working in their 60s and 70s, and their parents may be in their 80s and 90s. And it's a lot. It's a lot. And then you add the financial burden on top of that. People can't afford to miss a paycheck. And by the same token, it's not cheap to have caregivers. Even if you paid a bare minimum of $10 an hour, 4 hours a day, that's $40 a day, but then you multiply that out by 6-7 days a week, it's a lot. And then it's, letting people into your home and all these things. So, conversations, just, the holidays are coming. It's a good time if you're blessed enough not to have a dire situation in your family, or someone who's very ill, but they may be aging, they may be elderly. And you can't imagine your 98-year-old grandma is not going to be here next Christmas, but percentage-wise, it's a bigger percentage she probably wouldn't be here. But what could we do? What will we do? What is the plan? Just there's even games out there. I say games, but tools. There's something called the Death Deck. People play Monopoly. It's not very fun, but the tone that they use, and it's just kind of like what if questions.
Actually, the Death Deck is pretty fun.
Yeah.
Half of the question, or half of the cards have a multiple choice question, and there's usually kind of one extreme, the other extreme, and then a funny something a little bit tongue in cheek to, so yeah, the death deck's a little lighter than some of the other ones. I really like that game.
Yeah. Would you rather have death by nachos or be eaten by a school of piranhas, which is, a very benign question, a little humorous, but at least you're talking, and it often can lead, to people saying, sometimes we have families that don't even know, and their loved one can no longer speak for themselves. Do they want to be cremated, or do they want a traditional burial? And financially, that's a huge difference. People not even knowing that you have, shopping for your end of life plans. One of the guests on my show this few months ago, there's actually, just to throw that in there, there's a great website called Funeralocity. It's Funeralocity, like Travelocity, where you can go in, put your zip code in, and it'll pull up all the providers for funeral homes and cremation in your area with the prices. So now, I had said on my show this past week, there's really no excuse for people to really start exploring. It's not even, you don't even have to make a phone call. In the privacy of your home, when you're in a certain kind of headspace, go on your computer and in the doses that you can tolerate, to Google some things and to break that ice and to start researching out of, even if it's just sheer curiosity. It's not your current reality, but it will eventually be. And it may even be information for you to help others that are struggling. And, so again, people think, oh, well, cremation's cheaper than a funeral. But what is cheaper? There's $2,000 price point. And somebody told me just recently, oh yeah, they told me, $6,000 was a great deal. You might want to shop a little if money is an issue, and then often it is. So yeah, I don't know if I gave an answer to your original. I wish there was a straight up answer.
But what I think about, Abigail, I think you and I, both being those diagnosed with breast cancer, talk about choice and how empowering. You were asking about, like, how can we empower each other? It's having that choice, right? So much has been stripped already, but what do we have control over, and what can we decide and have these conversations? And that in and of itself, I think, is incredibly empowering and hopeful, right? Like, okay, yes, we are talking about death, but if I get to choose how I want that to be, it could be a very beautiful thing. And as we're coming to terms and making sense of our own realities, I think that is just another tool in that toolbox of, okay, well, do I want flowers and what type of music, or do I want, like, to be at home? And then I love those ideas of, okay, well, then having those conversations with your oncologist and your medical team to make sure that you're setting those goals and working towards those goals. I think that's wonderful.
And also on the flip side too, it's you all having the courage to have the conversations. What a blessing and a gift for your family to not only not have to ask so much, but to not have to, they'll be executing our wishes or your wishes, or whoever has the courage to voice them, even if you haven't written them down. At least you gave the family something to work with, so that takes that giant burden of making choices for someone. It completely flips the script.
Oh, absolutely. That's the bottom line is in all of this, I think, is, Bob used to say, the patient's going to be fine. It's the family you worry about. And the fact Bob and I talked about all of this, it didn't hasten it. It didn't delay it, and it didn't make it any less sad. I mean, it's still excruciatingly sad. What it's not is confusing or regretful or remorseful. I had the confidence that I was doing exactly what he wanted. Not only up until the moment he took his last breath, and then as we honored him with his memorial service, and all of those things that went with it. So and just to be able to focus simply on loving him and then missing him and mourning him instead of wondering how I was going to pay for it all, spending time doing, I don't even want to think about if he hadn't wanted to sell the house and move into the smaller space and sort of get things straightened up for me. If I had to do all that by myself after his death, it would have been just so much harder and awful than it, like I said, it didn't take away any sadness. I still miss him every single day. But I also am unburdened of a bunch of administrative stuff, and I am bolstered by the fact that I know for a fact that he felt loved and cared for exactly as he defined that till the very end and beyond. So that's an excellent point, Valerie, as to what it does for the family, for the survivors. And I would add a kind of a dovetail onto this and the previous question, and that is, if you are the person that the patient, that the person who's dying is confiding in, it's a good idea that, especially if there are other adults involved, whether it's their siblings or your adult children, it's a good idea to establish that you're the one, whether it's with the patient together. So if your husband is the one, that you're making clear that your parents understand that, so that because that's another place I think things can go sideways, is when a couple, for example, has talked things through very thoroughly, but the person hasn't told their own parents or the adult children that they've talked through things very thoroughly. And so this didn't happen to me. It didn't happen to me in any of my situations because I was it. But, it could have happened, I guess, in a couple of them, but it didn't, because it was just very clear that I was it. And I think that times when it's not very clear, that can end up causing, again, a bunch of, some of the questions, Valerie, that you talked about earlier with the crowd, and that there's one who kind of gets it, and there's kind of one who sometimes doesn't get it. And just kind of, if you have that position when the patient is able to talk about it and has their own agency, as Laura brought up, in their own, controlling end of life, that's a valuable thing to bring to the dynamic.
So I'd like to go back to Valerie, and how do you recommend, as a person who is dying, how do you recommend they deal with that rogue family member who isn't necessarily on board? I mean, obviously it sounds like Jen is saying talking and more talking is helpful, so that they know that it's your wishes. But since there's always one in the family.
Document, Miss Attorney.
Okay, that's a good recommendation.
There's a lot to be said for your advance directives. There's so many different ways and avenues nowadays to do that. There's your traditional living wills. Toward very end of life, there's the POST, the physician order for scope of treatment, and every state's a little different, but that's considered signed by a physician in a medical order. That would, when you are able to make your own decisions and sign that yourself, there's very little wiggle room for somebody to dispute that whenever you may be in a position of yourself that you can't speak for yourself. It's a layer of protection. It's a layer of support for, the family members that do get it and want to support your wishes. Again, so then that rogue person has to just go sit down or go, make noise elsewhere. that's really helpful. I'm also an affiliate for something called Video, My Informed Decisions on Video, which is a new emerging avenue for people to document on video what their wishes are. So that's kind of innovative, where there's, you scan a code, a QR code on a card, like your ID or your insurance card, and you pop up on the screen on any device saying, my name is Valerie Armand, and in the event that such and such, this is what I do and do not want. Again, that's just even less wiggle room for somebody to dispute your wishes. And again, verbally, just keeping your team, know who's going to be there when you can't be.
If I may, I think the ideal situation is when the patient, him or herself, takes a moment with the rogue person and says, I know this is so hard for you, but John or Joe or Susan really knows what I want, and I would love it if you could just support her or him in that. It's most powerful coming from the person who's dying. If that's not an option, I think, and I'm sure you've experienced this, Valerie, there's someone else too in the family who recognizes that someone's going rogue and can intervene a little bit and say, I know you see things differently, but we need to do what mom or dad or whoever wants. So.
And also, as the nurse,
yeah,
I'm always going to advocate for the patient.
Yeah.
And sometimes you have to really kind of reframe things, like we were all here. We all, just that gentle outside, not your regular family member that, you can lash out at, like I verified, I heard what she said, so that brings me back to saying how important it is to shop for your health care just as diligently as you shop for your aggressive treatment. There's, like Jennifer had said about going inpatient, and you had asked, did he know where or what? Depending on where you live, there may be only one hospice provider. Where I live, there are about 12 to 15 hospice providers. And although they all are supposed to be operating bare minimum under Medicare requirements, there's a huge difference out there. And unfortunately, I've experienced that, in my career. And again, at that point, do you really want to start over? You may get a hospice. Oh, my doctor said to use this one. Well, that's because your doctor is probably their medical director, and more than likely, on their payroll. And it behooves him to have a higher census. I could tell you all the ins and outs of hospice and how to be savvy on that end of it. What questions to ask me. I don't know if you've done that as a webinar yet, but that would be a really great one to, myths and misconceptions. And so many times I've had people just think that there's just hospice is hospice. And, that's not the case. And it's their benefit to use any way they see fit. And if you happen to get into a situation where you're not satisfied, it's a single piece of paper to sign to transfer to another hospice. And unfortunately, at that point, you may then realize what questions you should or should not be asking, but that's wasted precious time where you've not been able to build a bond and a trust with your clinicians that are coming into your home, journeying with you. And so whenever there may be a bump in the road and they're going to direct you a certain way, you're going to have 100% trust that that's going to be in your best interest, and that you're receiving all the services that you are entitled to, and the scope of all that they provide, and some provide more than others, above and beyond, and some just the bare minimum, and that's very unfortunate. You think, oh, they're on hospice, it's going to be a great journey. Not if you're not prepared. It can be a little disappointing.
It's such a great reminder to shop for a hospice organization, or shop for whatever the label is for those end of life services, just like you're shopping for the people who are taking care of us during our active treatment or curative treatment. And I know that in one of our previous webinars, we talked about there being an allowance that these organizations get, and then they have a lot of control over how that allowance is applied. So some hospice organizations will have Reiki and yoga, or those things that are considered complementary, or acupuncture, whereas a different organization might have spent a lot of money building up, say, their chaplain services, or some other specific thing. And so thinking about interviewing and making sure you know exactly what you're entitled to and then what it is that you want, so important. But Jen, I wanted to come back to you because in the last webinar that you were on, you just kept throwing out all these amazing caregiver support groups and organizations, and from talking to so many people in this space, there just isn't that much available for caregivers, at least that people are super familiar with. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about those organizations, and as the focus, I mean, in all cancer treatments, the focus is always on the person who has cancer, right? And supporting that person, but the caregiver is along for that same ride. And can you go over some of those organizations, your favorites maybe?
Okay, yeah, I have a number of them listed on my website. I have a page on my website called Resources, which has a number of these organizations listed. So hospicedoctorswidow.com, and then the resources page has not only all, actually, now that I think about it, not only does it have a list of these organizations, but it also has a thing I call the Croak folder, or the death dossier, and that's just a graphic that I created that kind of lists out all of the items that you should probably be setting aside, so that those documents are all in one place when the time comes. But anyway, so yeah, there's a on that website there's a caregiver hotline that is, while it's not 24/7, it is some extended hours that cover sort of East to West Coast basic business hours, and I think some on the weekend. And there is another thing that I've recommended in the past is on I'm on Instagram quite a bit, and if you Instagram allows you to follow hashtags more than I think Facebook does. And so I follow hashtag caregiver, hashtag family caregiver, and that has been incredibly helpful. Of course, I didn't know about it when I was a caregiver, but that's not important. But it really it allows you to find some people. It allows you to feel a lot less alone, which to me was the big issue, is that I felt so alone. And if you follow those hashtags at least on Instagram, and I'm not a Twitter person, I have a Twitter account, but I'm just learning it. And but you really connect with some wonderful people that are in palliative care, that are in the business, and everything from memes that just really make you feel supported, to some resources. So that would be my other big recommendation for a very practical thing, to connect. Of course, the AARP has some great caregiver resources, family caregiver resources, and I I would say though, for caregivers, those are the main ones. There is a thing called Caring Bridge. Your folks might be familiar with that because it's a way to update people on your status. And as things get sort of more intense, it can be a useful tool. I chose not to use it because the updates were going to be all on me, and I didn't have it in myself to do a Caring Bridge page for Bob. I sent email updates, but in a lot of family situations, the Caring Bridge can be a really great resource where people can sort of get these real-time updates and make comments and things like that. And then there's another one that's also on my website on that page that's about organizing meals and support. So yeah, there really are some remarkable tools.
And I've also loved your regular updates on your Facebook page, just encouraging caregivers and talking about how, you've what is it? Your track record for dealing with hard days is 100%, right? And you can take care of today too, and all of that. So follow Jen O'Brien on Facebook for some of those other just pick-me-ups, and because I think that sometimes it's important to remind people that what they're dealing with right now isn't permanent, right?
Right.
Were you going to add something else? I'm sorry.
I was just going to say that yes, that November was National Caregiver Month, and I really tried to post every day in November. And then as it ended, I was like, well, this is a shame because now we're getting into really one of the hardest seasons for family caregivers. The holidays just adds just this layer of pressure, and so I did a caregiver advent or holiday countdown. It's not religious in any way, except that it takes, December 1 through 24, and just like opening that little door and getting a little gem that says, you know what, you're fabulous. And if your care recipient won't tell you, I will tell you, you're fabulous.
All those reminders are so great. So we're hitting the 5 o'clock hour here. So I want to give each of you an opportunity to share any last gems with us, and then your word for our conversation today. What word resonates with you? So we're going to do the last thoughts, and then I'll come back for your words, so you can be thinking about that. Valerie, would you like to share any last thoughts with our listeners?
Sure. To tag on resources, the NHPCO.org is the National Hospice and Palliative Care Organization, has a lot of resources. They're very active on social media as far as supporting caregivers and patients themselves. So there's really great articles and resources there. I also would encourage, again, this social media that's been a blessing and a curse this year with the coronavirus, but we probably maybe wouldn't be Zooming right now as freely as people Zoom on a daily basis. That's just our new norm, which has really opened up a giant world of support for so many people. You can go to the Death Cafe website. There's people doing the virtual death cafes where they talk about life, death, and everything in between. There's actually a lot of just support groups for people that are taking care of loved ones on hospice or on hospice themselves, and even for those that are employed within end of life care to support one another. Dying Your Way, that I'm affiliated with, we do a Dying Your Way cafe once a month at the first Tuesday of every month. Jennifer's joined us on that, and so yeah, it's just really, again, just a safe environment, friendly, safe, and in most of these, you can go on and just listen and not share your camera or have to even speak, but just to be in that space with others that are going through similar or same situations. So yeah, that's just my advice, is to, you can put yourself out there as far or as small as you want to these days. Again, if it's just dipping your toe in and looking for some info, to going all in and actually participating in groups. So it's a different world, but it's a good one.
Jennifer, do you have any last gems for us?
That's it, is survivorship, that is, as the caregiver and survivor of your loved one, while you're caregiving, you are managing your own, prospectively managing your own survivorship. I had a big day one day when Bob and I had an argument, and one of the pages in the journal is, we're going through two different processes. He is dying, I am surviving. They're intertwined, but I will be here, and I will have to live with how I conducted myself. I will have to live, with myself afterward. And that survivorship is so important to your well-being as you go on with life. And I have just really wonderful memories of loving him, up until the end, and things come up, and I thank him. We set up my survivor benefits with the Veterans Administration, and so like every time I schedule a doctor's appointment, I say thanks, Bob, because we took care of that. So so your survivorship and your memories, you're making your memories and you're carrying them with you, and there won't be a chance to do over. There won't be a do-over in all of the caregiving, and there won't be a do-over in end of life. There will be one time.
Thank you. Valerie, what would you say is the word that would describe the discussions that we've had today in this webinar?
I think I kind of started off with it. And it's really struck me since I actually had that first conversation with you, is just humble. Humility. Again, I can talk all day long. And yes, I've had losses, and yes, I journey with those, but I don't have that particular or that significant diagnosis personally. And so just always keeping that in the front of my brain, not even in the back of my brain, that, having that, just keeping that present when I am having conversations with people, to never take it lightly. And just because, I can speak it, but I'm not living it. And so I just admire you ladies and your world for not just being out there supporting and advocating like, maybe Jennifer and I are doing, but you're doing it maybe in spite of or despite, your reality. And I think that's just incredible. And it's important work.
Thank you, Valerie. Appreciate that. Jen, how about you?
Yeah, I think I will go back to intimacy. I think Valerie said that very, very well. This is an incredibly special group. There's no question about that. But since I can't take hers, I will say
we can share.
Yes, we could share. We could share. Yeah, that intimacy, that it is a very, very intimate time. And if you allow it to be, if you lean into it, even though it's sad, even though it's the hardest thing you'll ever do it, because you won't regret it. You won't regret really, really talking about it and really getting close and just being present for each other. You'll never regret that.